Okay, guys, this lesson is about slavery and the empires that it spawned in the Americas. Partly for the British, partly for the French, and partly for the Spanish, but mostly as we'll look at as far as the English and how and its effect on the North American colonies. I do want to preface this by saying that today's lesson will kind of look at slavery in an economic light. And sometimes that's hard for us to do because it was such a dramatic and tragic story. But it was part of that mercantilist economic plan. Now, I will touch on what we're going to cover tomorrow, which is part of that more tragic and dramatic story, because we are going to get the Middle Passage. And the Middle Passage, is, as you know, is part of the triangular trade. And it was that southern leg, or that sort of forced transportation of Africans from Africa to the New World, which was just a horrific trip. And that will be that story that will be played out in class tomorrow in our simulation. But today we're going to look at more of the economic part of it. So we want to look at the early beginnings of slavery. So if you think about it, and particularly for us, it's only going to be in the English colonies. All right. So the English colonies, the first ones were in 1619. The first sort of shipment of slaves came to Jamestown because of the advent of tobacco that was created by James Rolfe, and now that sort of cash crop that was starting to take hold. The other thing that kind of affected us as in the Caribbean, though, to a certain extent, was sugar now becomes an everyday item. It's no longer a luxury item. Now, why? Because of that, is there going to be more emphasis on slavery? If you think about it, because it's now going to become an everyday item, there's going to be sugar is now going to be mass produced. So if it's going to be mass produced, you're going to need more slaves to do that. The other thing, the other piece of this sort of sort of equation, if you will, in the 1680s, the decline of indentured servitude. And the reason why this is because in England, finally, wages were starting to be better in Europe. And so there was less of that push-pull factor that we've talked about so much in class the first few weeks. The other thing, too, are the cruel numbers. Now, this may surprise you. And I know that when I first started researching this long time ago about slavery and the importation of slaves to America, it surprised me. The peak period was 1701 to 1810. But over half the slaves that were imported from Africa to the Americas came to the Caribbean, which for the sugar plantations of the Caribbean, and they were horrific places. For a lot of slaves, that was the death knell, because the malaria and the cholera and the other sorts of diseases that were just rampant in the Caribbean made the mortality rate for slaves there much lower than in the northern colonies. A third went to Brazil. 10% went to Spanish America, and 5% came here to North America. Of those slaves, it was by a 2-to-1 margin in which men enslaved outnumbered women by a 2-to-1. And the reason for that was men were considered more of a durable, stronger sort of asset in the fields. That's hard for us to kind of think of in those terms, but it's true. But the bottom line, and the reason why oftentimes these empires were created, were sort of on the backs of slaves. Most European colonial economies in the Americas from 16th to 19th century depended upon enslaved African labor, because so much emphasis was put on cash crops. And in pre-industrial age, the only way those crops could be produced was by a multitude of slaves. Now, we will go into the treatment of slaves a lot more as we get closer to the Civil War, but it's important to know that there's a certain protocol or certain sort of rules that were put in place that were sort of imported from the Caribbean to the Americas. These were called the Barbados Slave Codes. And with these, it sort of established, like I said, rules. I hate to say that, but rules for slavery. And it also closed loopholes to freedom. If you were a Christian, just because you were baptized, it did not necessarily change the conditions of slavery. You would still be a slave. If you were born to a mother who was a slave, then you were born into servitude. There was no escaping that. The other byproducts of the Barbados slave codes are, or certain other slave codes, would be they were not allowed to congregate. Now, we'll talk about this again as we get closer to the Civil Wars in the 1800s, but the reasons for that are obvious. They're not allowed to congregate because the fear would be a mass sort of insurrection or rebellion. The other thing is it was against law to educate slaves. Now, of course, depending upon the slave owner, sometimes they looked the other way, and some slaves were taught how to read much later on. But the worry was that if slaves were educated, and the more education you have, the more power you have, and you're able to compare your life to others. And so that was sort of stymied. There was not allowed there was no education of slaves initially. It was against the law to travel, again, the fear of escape. And also, killing a slave during punishment did not constitute a felony, which seems shocking to us today. But that was part of the Barbados slave codes. I mean, sometimes it could be a fine or something like that. But in reality, there was no felony attached to that crime. You were dumb if you did it because it was your own property, but nevertheless, it was not considered corporal punishment at that time. What do these slave codes lead to? Well, as you can see by this former slave on the left, abusive beatings, which leads to scar tissue, which we will again investigate that later on the semester. Mutilations, and also burning alive and castration, particularly mutilations, burning alive, castration, if a slave was known to lead or take part in some sort of slave insurrection. Now, there were different types of plantations in the South, and it kind of differs depending upon the upper South or the lower South. And so first we'll look at the lower South, and this is pre-cotton era, okay? So we'll look at this. The main crop in the region before cotton was rice, and that was the benefit to this, I suppose you could say, was at first American Indians were used, and we know that did not work out well. And so that's when African slaves returned to, but also African slaves were returned to because, particularly West African slaves, they had experience in cultivating rice. And so there was no training there, and it took, it became a pretty quick cash crop, particularly though in the lower South. Also, what was grown lower South, and some of you guys may remember this, a very valuable and popular blue dye called indigo. And that also became prominent in Georgia and the Carolinas. In the upper South, you got it. There's the picture right there. And is tobacco. And tobacco was still very profitable but labor intensive. And this cash crop, which we know if you were going to make a lot of money at it, then you needed a lot of slaves to harvest it. In the Chesapeake region, we know is Virginia and Maryland, by then that region had self-sustaining population growth. And so there was really little importation of slaves by the mid-1700s because they were able to sustain their own sort of natural growth. By the 1750s, in fact, 80% of those slaves in that region were born there. Now, one of the things that whites or slave owners always feared, and justifiably so, was rebellion. And we'll talk more about these rebellions again as we get closer to the Civil War. But the example is the Stono Rebellion in 1722, which is one of the first ones. Slaves are always monitored during work and punished for offenses. And the only way that certain forms of resistance slaves could engage in were, for example, they could destroy property. Of course, when their master was not looking, or they could, what we call malinger, take their time or go at a very slow pace when performing some sort of task, or they could escape. Now, typically, escape was, for the most part, earlier on, was done by young men in their 20s, usually who were unattached, didn't have a wife, didn't have children. It was fairly easy for them to flee. They were leaving no ties behind, if you will. They would oftentimes create what we call these communities called maroons, communities of runaways in the woods or rural areas, and probably the most famous of them, or the most known, was Spanish Florida, which oftentimes they would go to the Everglades and live amongst the other Indians. In fact, it's thought that the Seminoles were offsprings of the Creeks and African offspring. And so these maroon communities were not only also, though, in Spanish Florida, but also in certain mountain regions and places like that where cash crops or the desire for farmland left those regions fairly remote. Now, that's it for today's lesson, and for which I didn't really want this to go any longer than 10 minutes, but I do want to, so you've looked at most of chapter 4 there. Tomorrow we'll look at mercantilism after you take your quiz, but I do want you to think about tomorrow's simulation after we do this. And the watchwords for this are maturity and respect. And I'm asking you as AP seniors to act with decorum, to act with maturity. Don't mess around, because the thing that we're going to be asked to do is we're going to kind of delve into the middle passage in a fairly deep level. And there are certain questions I want you to ponder. I mean, certain things like how were slaves captured? How was that gone about? Also, how were slaves transported? And of course, we know they were transported in ships. But I mean, the question is, could you endure those conditions that those slaves did? And we will look at those conditions in a more simulated, specific level. And how were the slaves sold once they reached land? Some of you may know this. Some of you may not know the protocol that goes with that. But that's what we'll look at tomorrow, and that'll wrap up chapter 4. All right, thanks for watching this, and I look forward to tomorrow's simulation.